Welcome to Somnia Lore, your place for peaceful, sleepy adventures. Subscribe to our channel, hit the bell icon.
The first thing he noticed was the faint shimmer of light curling through the cracks of the winter night. It wasn't the sun, of course, it was far too late for that, but some quiet, inexplicable glow that seemed to hum just beyond the edge of sight.
Morty always remembered that moment, even though he would have sworn he was too young to truly understand what it meant. And yet, something in the air, a soft vibration he could feel rather than hear, suggested that the world was older
and deeper than he had ever imagined. He took a slow breath, letting the chill of the December air settle in his lungs, and for a few heartbeats he simply listened. The snow outside his window rustled softly against the panes, a lullaby of white feathers brushing across glass. It was on nights like this that Rick's presence felt both enormous and absent at the same time. He wasn't loud, not in the way you'd expect from someone so impossibly full of ideas, so quick with answers that sometimes felt sharper than the edges of the coldest icicle. No, Rick moved like water through a quiet house, unpredictable. Yes, but with a certain rhythm that only Morty could sense. And Morty did sense it. He sensed it in the way the shadows of the room bent slightly toward him as Rick worked at some strange contraption in the corner, the way the faintest smile tugged at the corners of Rick's mouth when he noticed Morty staring. It was a smile that carried 1,000 meanings, most of them unspoken, but all of them oddly reassuring. Morty wrapped his blanket tighter around his shoulders, the worn fabric comforting in its familiarity. He had grown up in a house that smelled faintly of motor oil and toasted bread, where mornings felt hurried, but evenings stretched like warm, soft taffy into the quiet hours of the night. That was the sort of house that left marks, gentle but enduring, on the soul. He often thought about how tiny moments, the way light spilled across a cluttered table, the smell of a cup of coffee left too long on the counter, the way a small laugh could fill a room without warning, could become as significant as anything else in life. Perhaps that was what he had learned from Rick, in small, almost invisible doses, that there is significance in subtlety, in quiet acts, in noticing the world when no one else does. And tonight, as snowflakes fell like soft whispers against the window pane, Morty felt the peculiar weight of expectation that always came with Rick's mysterious undertakings. He had learned early on that Rick's projects were never ordinary. They were always slightly impossible, tinged with danger, often inexplicably poetic. Anatomy Park, for example, was supposed to be a place of wonder, a miniature universe of human anatomy turned amusement park. Yet even in the midst of its bizarre attractions, it carried an unspoken lesson. Small things mattered, the details mattered, and sometimes the smallest creature could teach the biggest truths. Morty could still remember the first time he had stepped into one of Rick's worlds, a place that existed simultaneously in reality and imagination, where the normal rules of size, gravity, and time seemed to fold upon themselves like paper cranes in mid-air. He had been terrified, yes, but also enthralled in a way that was impossible to describe. The corridors, lined with glowing veins and tiny scaffolds, seemed alive, breathing slowly in and out, as though the park itself had a heartbeat that only he could feel. He had tiptoed along the miniature streets, listening to the faint echoes of tiny conversations, marveling at the intricate perfection of each microscopic element. And somewhere in that maze of wonder and peril, Morty had felt an unexpected surge of something vast and indescribable. Responsibility, yes, but also a strange tenderness toward the smallest forms of life, as if he could sense their hopes and fears intertwined with his own. Rick had appeared then, as he always did, with that familiar flick of impatience softened by a hint of care. "Don't get yourself lost, Morty," he had said, not sternly, but in a voice that seemed to recognize Morty's tentative curiosity as something rare, something precious. Morty had nodded, swallowing a mixture of awe and fear, feeling as though he was stepping across the threshold of his own potential, though he couldn't have named it at the time. He didn't yet know that moments like these would shape him, subtly but irrevocably, teaching him the quiet courage of noticing, of tending, of existing fully, even when surrounded by the impossible. The night deepened, and the soft hum outside mingled with the faint ticking of a clock somewhere down the hall. Morty traced his fingers along the edges of the blanket, feeling the threads fray under his touch, and thought about how much time had passed since the earliest days of his childhood, the days when everything had felt both enormous and impossibly fragile. There had been times of laughter, yes, but also moments of profound quiet when the world seemed to pause and whisper in a language only the heart could understand. It was in those pauses, he realized, that real growth had happened, not the kind recorded in notebooks or measured by any ordinary standard, but the kind that settled deep into one's bones, shaping empathy, curiosity, and the ability to care, even when it was difficult. Outside, the snow continued its gentle descent, transforming the familiar world into a landscape of soft white light. Morty imagined Rick moving among the tiny lights of Anatomy Park, the diminutive park-goers going about their peculiar routines, unaware of the vast cosmos surrounding them. And yet in that imagined world, Morty felt a profound sense of connection, a realization that even the smallest forms of life, even the tiniest flickers of consciousness, carried weight, meaning, and beauty. He wondered if Rick ever thought about it that way, or if it was a truth Morty had to discover for himself, quietly and slowly, over many long, snow-filled nights. He let his eyes close for a moment, just a fraction of time, feeling the rhythm of his own heartbeat echo through his chest. It was a rhythm in harmony with the flickering lights, the falling snow, and the quiet murmur of life both seen and unseen. And in that stillness, he allowed himself a small, unspoken gratitude for Rick, for the strange and wondrous worlds, for the tiny lessons hidden in impossible places, and for the simple act of being alive on a night that was at once ordinary and entirely magical. And somewhere in the gentle hum of the night, he thought he could hear a whisper, almost inaudible, almost imagined, carrying a single, unassuming promise that the story was only just beginning, that small hearts and quiet hands could shape worlds, and that even in the deepest snow, the faintest light could guide the way. The snow outside thickened, settling into soft drifts. That seemed to swallow the edges of the familiar world, leaving only gentle shapes and muffled sounds. Morty sat at the edge of his bed, tracing the grain of the wooden frame with his fingertips, and thought about the first time he had truly felt the peculiar pull of curiosity and awe that Rick always seemed to inspire. It had been in the smallest, most unexpected ways, the way a shadow moved slightly too slowly, the way the flicker of a bulb seemed to pulse with its own secret heartbeat, the way Rick could take something as ordinary as a sandwich and make it feel like a doorway to another dimension. Those moments had become anchors in Morty's memory, quiet but persistent, holding him steady as the world shifted around him. He remembered the afternoon when Rick had first shown him the intricacies of Anatomy Park in its early planning stages. Morty had leaned over a miniature model, a fragile construct of tiny streets, veins, and organs, and for the first time he realized that scale could transform perception. The tiny figures moving along microscopic roads seemed both impossibly small and profoundly alive, each carrying a hint of personality, purpose, and hope. Morty had asked questions naturally, questions that came softly with a touch of hesitancy, like stepping onto ice for the first time. Rick had answered, not always directly, but in ways that nudged Morty toward observation and reflection. It wasn't lessons delivered with authority. It was the gentle shaping of understanding, a quiet invitation to see the world through a lens both precise and empathetic. That afternoon had left a lingering warmth in Morty's chest, one of those rare feelings that could survive the chill of winter nights. He had begun to notice small patterns, small signs that life carried meaning even in the most confined, unexpected spaces. Tiny gestures mattered, a whispered thank you, the careful placement of a delicate object, the attention given to someone, often overlooked. Morty started to see that these were the real forms of heroism, not grand feats or dramatic gestures, but subtle acts that rippled outward, often unseen, yet significant nonetheless. He carried that realization like a lantern, small but steady, lighting his way through both ordinary days and nights full of strange possibilities. On this particular evening, Rick appeared in the doorway, his silhouette softened by the dim light, spilling from the hallway. He didn't speak immediately, simply standing there, letting the quiet fill the space between them. Morty felt the familiar mix of awe and comfort, a sense that Rick's presence was vast and contained, chaotic, yet somehow grounded. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, almost conspiratorial, and the words carried a gravity that Morty understood instinctively. "Morty," Rick said, "you see all these little details because you're paying attention. Most people don't. They rush past, they miss the tiny miracles hiding in plain sight." Morty nodded, feeling the truth in the statement. He didn't need Rick to explain further. On this particular evening, Rick appeared in the doorway, his silhouette softened by the dim light spilling from the hallway. He didn't speak immediately, simply standing there, letting the quiet fill the space between them. Morty felt the familiar mix of awe and comfort, a sense that Rick's presence was vast and contained, chaotic yet somehow grounded. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, almost conspiratorial, and the words carried a gravity that Morty understood instinctively. "Morty," Rick said, "you see all these little details because you're paying attention. Most people don't. They rush past. They miss the tiny miracles hiding in plain sight." Morty nodded, feeling the truth in the statement. He didn't need Rick to explain further. The lesson had already woven itself into the fabric of his awareness. The two of them lingered there, neither wanting to break the quiet, until Rick finally motioned for Morty to follow. They walked together down the hall, past the familiar clutter of gadgets, old papers, and half-finished experiments, into a room that smelled faintly of metal and citrus, a combination Morty had grown strangely fond of. Rick handed him a small device, intricate but delicate, and Morty's fingers tingled as he held it. It was another layer of wonder, another door into complexity, yet it felt approachable because Rick had made it so. Morty understood, in a way that felt deep and instinctual, that growth often came wrapped in challenge, but also in trust, in the permission to explore, fail, and try again. The winter night outside seemed to soften even further as Morty and Rick moved through the house. Snowflakes drifted lazily past the windows, their descent measured and serene, almost like a deliberate dance. Morty noticed details he had never appreciated before, the way the frost painted delicate patterns across the glass, the faint hum of a heater blending with the quiet rhythm of the night, the distant bark of a dog muffled by the blanket of snow. Everything felt slowed down, heightened in its subtlety, and Morty felt the pulse of life around him more vividly than he had earlier that day. It was in these small observations that he discovered patience, a gentle understanding that the world didn't always need to be rushed, and that sometimes the deepest lessons arrived wrapped in silence. Rick guided Morty toward the small laboratory. They had built together a place where wonder and science merged seamlessly. Morty felt a familiar tingle of anticipation, but it wasn't fear. It was the quiet thrill of learning, of seeing possibilities bloom. Tiny models of organs, complex machines scaled down to unimaginable proportions, and scattered notes in Rick's messy handwriting covered every surface. Morty ran his fingers lightly over the tiny structures, imagining the lives and stories each element contained. And in that imagination, he discovered empathy, not just for the miniature inhabitants of Anatomy Park, but for the countless unseen lives around him in the broader world. Every detail mattered. Every movement mattered. Every heart, no matter how small, carried weight. The night deepened further, and Rick finally spoke again, this time in a tone that carried both instruction and a quiet reverence. "Remember, Morty," he said softly, "the world is alive in ways most people never notice. It's not about fighting battles or chasing glory. It's about seeing, understanding, and caring. Even the tiniest act can create echoes that last longer than you imagine." Morty nodded, absorbing the words as though they were a soft melody, lingering long after the notes had faded. He felt the truth of them in his chest, a quiet warmth that contrasted with the chill seeping through the windows. As they prepared to leave the laboratory, Morty felt a moment of reflection. He thought about the strange beginnings of his relationship with Rick, the countless hours of curiosity, fear, laughter, and wonder, and he realized that growth didn't always announce itself. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, like the slow folding of snow over the earth, yet it accumulated into something undeniable. Morty had become attuned to the small signs of beauty and meaning, able to recognize the profound in the mundane. And as he glanced at Rick, standing quietly among the models and gadgets, he felt a sense of gratitude, deep, gentle, unspoken, for the guidance, for the trust, and for the quiet, persistent belief that Morty could navigate worlds far larger than himself. The snow outside continued its lazy descent, settling in soft, endless layers, muffling sound and shaping the night into a gentle cocoon. Morty took a slow breath, feeling the rhythm of the evening seep into his chest, allowing the calm to deepen with each passing second. He thought of the microscopic streets and tiny inhabitants of Anatomy Park, imagined their whispered conversations, their small victories and struggles, and he understood, finally, that life, in all its forms, was a series of quiet wonders strung together like beads on an invisible thread. It was in noticing, in feeling, and in caring that meaning resided. Morty sat back in his chair, letting the warmth of the room and the soft light from the window envelope him. He felt the edges of the day blur into night, a seamless transition of reflection and serenity. He understood, in a way that felt both intimate and infinite, that his journey, quiet though it might be, was unfolding steadily, guided not by haste, but by attention, empathy, and the quiet courage to engage with the impossible and the overlooked alike. Somewhere in the distance, a snowflake landed softly on the sill, a tiny, perfect symbol of how the world, in its vastness, could still hold moments of exquisite delicacy. And Morty smiled, closing his eyes, letting the slow rhythm of the night, of breath, and of life itself lull him gently toward a calm, restful understanding of everything that had been and everything yet to come. The next morning arrived softly, not with the abruptness of alarm clocks or the harsh glare of sunlight, but with a gentle stretching of pale light across the walls. Morty opened his eyes to the quiet shimmer of snow on the roof outside, the world draped in a soft, silvery blanket. It was one of those mornings when time seemed to hesitate, allowing moments to linger longer than they otherwise might. Morty lay still for a few heartbeats, listening to the faint creak of floorboards and the distant hum of some machine Rick had left running overnight. In that suspended space, the ordinary felt extraordinary, and the extraordinary felt comforting. He remembered the lessons of the night before, the way Rick had spoken of noticing the small wonders hidden in plain sight, and he felt a faint thrill at the thought of exploring once more. Anatomy Park, with its miniature streets and impossible intricacies, called to him, not with urgency, but with quiet invitation. Morty dressed slowly, letting the warmth of thick socks and a sweater seep into him, carrying that sense of anticipation like a soft ember glowing in his chest. The air outside smelled faintly of pine and frost, a scent that always seemed to carry echoes of forgotten childhood memories, distant laughter, and the peculiar magic of winter mornings. Rick met him in the kitchen, silhouetted against the dim light that spilled from the window. He held a small clipboard, notes scrawled in, near illegible handwriting, and a faint grin tugged at the edges of his face. "Morning, Morty," he said, voice low and unhurried. "Ready to see things from a slightly different angle today?" Morty nodded, feeling both the thrill of curiosity and the comfort of guidance. There was a rhythm to Rick's teaching, a rhythm that didn't rely on commands or rules, but on subtle encouragement, on the slow unfolding of perception and understanding. It was a rhythm that Morty had come to trust, a rhythm that made even the most surreal worlds feel navigable and safe. They moved together through the house, past the familiar clutter and past the soft glow of light that pooled over scattered gadgets. Each step Morty took felt purposeful yet gentle, a meditation in motion. He imagined the tiny streets of Anatomy Park, picturing the inhabitants going about their day, unaware of the larger world that surrounded them. He thought about how fragile and resilient they were, how even the smallest actions could ripple outward, shaping events in ways unseen yet profound. It was in these moments, when imagination intertwined seamlessly with observation, that Morty felt his understanding of life deepen in ways he could not yet fully articulate. When they arrived at the lab, the air smelled faintly of warmth and metal, familiar and oddly comforting. Rick gestured for Morty to look closer at the miniature structures they had been developing, highlighting the delicate scaffolding of organs, the intricate pathways of arteries, and the tiny bridges that connected one area to another. Morty's eyes followed every line and curve, absorbing the meticulous care evident in each detail. He felt a quiet awe, not of spectacle, but of the intimacy of creation, the idea that something so small could hold such life, such nuance, such complexity. It reminded him that attention, patience, and care were themselves forms of magic. As he studied the models, Morty's mind wandered to the people they represented, the lives, choices, and stories embedded in every curve. He imagined the scientists, the park-goers, the inhabitants, each carrying dreams, fears, and quiet triumphs. It was as if the world, both miniature and vast, existed in a delicate balance, and Morty, standing at the edge of it all, felt the weight and the wonder of responsibility. Rick watched him closely, perhaps sensing the shift in perception, and Morty realized that growth often occurred in silence, in observation, in the absorption of patterns rather than the execution of dramatic deeds. The morning light shifted subtly, and Rick led Morty toward a new section of the park, one that had not yet been fully explored. The corridors were narrow, lined with tiny pipes and glowing panels that pulsed faintly with life. Morty's steps were careful, deliberate, and he found that he welcomed the slowness, the requirement to be mindful, to notice details that could otherwise escape attention. In the stillness of these miniature avenues, he discovered a kind of quiet bravery, not the outward heroism sung in stories, but an inward courage rooted in empathy, observation, and care. Rick's voice broke the silence occasionally, soft and guiding, offering small insights rather than instructions. "See how the pathways twist here," he said, pointing to a tiny junction. "It's easy to miss, but it shapes everything around it. Same with people, Morty. The smallest choices often determine the biggest outcomes, even if no one notices immediately." Morty nodded, feeling the words settle into his mind like gentle snowflakes. He understood, instinctively, that noticing, attending, and caring were themselves forms of quiet heroism, and that his journey, though subtle, was significant. They paused near a miniature plaza within the park, where tiny figures mingled and moved with delicate purpose. Morty studied them, noticing small gestures, the way one figure helped another over a bridge, the way a light flickered to illuminate a path, the way quiet expressions communicated more than words ever could. He thought about how these moments mirrored his own life, the unseen acts of kindness, the attentive observations, the moments when he had been present without fanfare or recognition. In that reflection, he felt a surge of connection, a reminder that even in a world of impossibilities, empathy and awareness could create profound impact. Time moved with unusual softness, stretching and folding in ways that made the world feel both vast and intimate. Morty felt the rhythm of his own heartbeat echoing faintly in concert with the tiny pulses of light and motion around him. He realized that growth, understanding, and quiet courage were cultivated in moments like this, in the careful alignment of attention and reflection. He thought of his early days with Rick, of snow-filled nights and the subtle warmth of trust, and he felt a gentle continuity, the sense that every small lesson, every whispered insight had shaped him toward this quiet, observant state of being. As the afternoon waned, Rick guided Morty toward a final observation point, a tiny balcony overlooking a miniature landscape within Anatomy Park. Morty leaned lightly on the railing, letting his gaze sweep over the intricate streets, bridges, and buildings. He imagined the lives unfolding below, each filled with quiet stories, small victories, and subtle heartbreaks. The sense of scale did not diminish their significance. If anything, it amplified it. Morty understood that attention and care, no matter how small, were what rendered life meaningful. He felt a calm satisfaction in witnessing it, a quiet reassurance that his role, however subtle,
mattered. The snow outside continued to fall softly,
and Morty felt a gentle fatigue seep into his limbs, a pleasant, meditative weariness. He realized that the quiet moments of observation, reflection, and connection were themselves restorative, that growth need not be hurried, that learning and empathy could unfold with the patient rhythm of falling snow. And as he exhaled, he felt the familiar warmth of Rick's presence nearby, a grounding reminder that even in the midst of strange, intricate worlds, there was guidance, trust, and the comforting constancy of shared experience. Morty closed his eyes briefly, letting the layers of the day, the wonder of the miniature universe, and the soft hum of life around him settle into a gentle reverie. He knew, in a quiet, unquestioned way, that he was being shaped not by grand battles or spectacular feats, but by the accumulation of small observations, tiny acts of care, and the willingness to engage fully with life's subtleties. And in that understanding, he felt a serene sense of purpose, a deepening of empathy, and a soft anticipation for the days yet to unfold, each filled with the quiet promise of discovery, connection, and wonder. The evening settled over the house like a soft sigh, a gentle hush that seemed to pause time itself. Morty lingered by the window, watching the last of the day's light bleed slowly into the snowy horizon. It was the kind of twilight that invited reflection, when shadows lengthened but did not frighten, and the world felt intimate, folded in on itself like a protective blanket. Morty's thoughts drifted, as they often did in these quiet hours, to the lessons of the day, to the subtle revelations of Anatomy Park, and to the strange, unwavering presence of Rick. He realized that growth often arrived quietly, in ways that could only be sensed, not measured. Rick appeared without a sound, his steps softened by the carpet, his eyes reflecting the muted glow from the snow outside. He carried a small, intricate device in his hands, something that hummed faintly, as if it were aware of its surroundings. Morty felt a familiar mixture of awe and comfort, the quiet thrill of knowing that even in ordinary moments, Rick could guide him toward new understanding. "Morty," Rick said, voice low and reflective, "today wasn't just about looking at tiny things. It's about noticing the connections between them, how small acts, small choices, can change the rhythm of everything around you." Morty nodded slowly, absorbing the meaning without needing further explanation. He had learned to trust that insight often came in gentle, almost imperceptible doses. They moved together toward the living room, where scattered notes, half-finished gadgets, and stray models littered the surfaces. Morty's gaze drifted over them, noticing details he had overlooked before, the way a tiny lever caught the light, the way a pattern in the dust seemed almost deliberate, the way shadows bent across surfaces as if whispering their own stories. In these small observations he found a strange sense of calm, a quiet confirmation that paying attention could reveal beauty and purpose in the most mundane or improbable places. It was a lesson he carried close to his chest, a secret warmth that he could access whenever the world felt too loud or chaotic. Rick handed him the humming device, guiding Morty's hands gently. "We're going to see something new," he said, not with urgency, but with the kind of quiet assurance that made Morty feel capable. Together they walked toward a hidden door in the corner, one that led to a smaller, less explored section of the park. The walls there were lined with minuscule corridors and tiny archways, each meticulously crafted. Morty felt the familiar tug of curiosity, that subtle excitement that wasn't about thrill, but about understanding, about witnessing the delicate intricacies of a universe within his grasp. He stepped carefully, feeling the rhythm of the park beneath his feet, as though it had its own pulse he could sync with if he tried. As they explored, Morty noticed patterns emerging, tiny gestures repeated by the miniature inhabitants, the way bridges connected unlikely places, the subtle flow of energy that seemed to hum through the veins of the park. He realized that the world, even at its smallest scale, was not chaotic, but composed of rhythms, relationships, and choices. The inhabitants, though imperceptibly tiny, exhibited behaviors that mirrored the grandest truths of human life: empathy, patience, courage, and kindness. Morty's chest warmed with understanding. Even the smallest beings, the tiniest actions, carried significance. And in noticing them, he was participating in a kind of quiet heroism, one that required presence rather than spectacle. Rick's voice occasionally punctuated the silence.
"See that, Morty?
A single bridge can shift an entire flow. A small gesture can redirect outcomes. Life isn't always loud. Sometimes the most profound changes happen quietly, subtly, almost invisibly." Morty nodded, feeling the weight of the statement settle in his mind. He thought of his own life, of moments when he had acted or observed with care, and realized that these small choices, unnoticed by most, had already shaped his path in ways he could not yet fully understand. They paused near a tiny square within the park, where several miniature figures interacted. Morty watched one figure help another across a narrow plank, the tiniest expressions conveying gratitude and trust. The scene, though microscopic, felt monumental in its implications. Morty understood then that relationships at any scale required attention, patience, and care. He thought about his own connections with family, friends, and with Rick himself, and realized that nurturing these bonds, however subtly, was a form of quiet mastery over chaos. The snow outside continued its slow descent, a soft curtain of white that made the world seem still and endless. Morty felt a deepening of his awareness, the gentle satisfaction of noticing, understanding, and caring for the rhythms around him. He thought of all the times he had been overlooked or underestimated, all the small victories and unacknowledged acts of kindness that had shaped him without fanfare. Each of these moments felt illuminated in the soft light of reflection, a subtle affirmation that his growth was real, even if it had not been measured by conventional standards. Rick guided him further into the park, showing him tiny passageways and hidden alcoves where even more delicate activity took place. Morty marveled at the intricacy of it all, realizing that the park was not merely a collection of miniature structures, but a living, breathing ecosystem of interaction, choice, and consequence. He thought about how often humans missed the significance of small gestures, how lives could be reshaped by the gentlest attention or the quietest act of care. Morty felt a surge of purpose, not loud or urgent, but deeply resonant. It was the kind of understanding that shaped the way he approached both life and relationships. As they moved toward the exit of the park's miniature section, Morty reflected on how he had come to understand Rick's lessons. They were not about grand heroism, spectacular discoveries, or dramatic victories. They were about presence, empathy, observation, and the subtle weaving of attention into the fabric of life. Morty felt the quiet thrill of understanding that he was participating in this rhythm, that even in the smallest of worlds he could act with care and notice the profound. The thought settled in his chest, warm and steady, like the soft pulse of a distant star he could almost touch. The evening deepened further, bringing with it a hush that wrapped the house in stillness. Morty lingered near a tiny balcony in the park, watching minuscule figures traverse the streets, climb delicate bridges, and interact in ways both simple and meaningful. He realized that life, in its essence, was a series of intricate connections, choices, and small acts that collectively shaped the course of existence. Even the smallest gestures could echo outward, unseen yet powerful, leaving traces in hearts and in worlds beyond immediate perception. Morty exhaled softly, feeling the gentle weight of understanding settle across him. As they returned to the warmth of the house, Morty felt an unusual serenity, a deep sense of satisfaction not born of accomplishment, but of presence. The lessons of the day, the quiet bravery, the significance of small acts, the delicate interplay of attention and empathy had sunk in, embedding themselves in his awareness. Outside, the snow continued to fall, each flake a miniature wonder, a soft reminder that life, however intricate or fleeting, was deserving of notice, care, and gentle reverence. Morty settled back into his chair, watching the fading light and listening to the soft hum of the night. He reflected on the slow, unhurried growth he had experienced, the subtle ways in which he had learned to observe, care, and act with empathy. It was a quiet heroism not celebrated or recognized, but profoundly important. And in that moment, with snow drifting silently outside and the warmth of the house surrounding him, Morty felt a deep, abiding connection to the world, to Rick, and to the miniature wonders he had witnessed. He understood, with gentle clarity, that life's true meaning often resided in the subtleties, in the quiet acts, in the patient noticing of what others might overlook. As the night deepened, Morty allowed himself a slow, deliberate exhale, letting the lessons, the reflections, and the quiet awe settle into his heart. He thought of all the small gestures he could make, the tiny acts of attention and care that could ripple outward in ways he might never fully see. And with that thought, he felt a calm, gentle sense of readiness for whatever the next day might bring. A quiet anticipation filled with empathy, observation, and the soft joy of being alive in worlds both vast and miniature. The morning came slowly, the kind of morning that felt like a soft exhale, carrying the lingering hush of the night before. Morty rose quietly, feeling the gentle weight of sleep still in his limbs, and peered through the window at a world transformed by the night's snow. The rooftops glimmered faintly under a delicate layer of frost, and the streets, usually sharp and busy in his mind, seemed muffled and serene. Even the faint sounds of the neighborhood, the distant bark of a dog, the soft rustle of leaves caught beneath the snow, were softened as if someone had turned the volume down on the world to allow it to breathe. Morty felt a curious mixture of anticipation and calm, the kind of feeling that comes before discovery rather than before action. Rick was already in the lab when Morty arrived, the faint hum of equipment filling the room like a low, comforting pulse. He looked up and offered the smallest of smiles, one that carried both amusement and an unspoken understanding of the quiet tension Morty carried inside. "Morning, Morty," he said softly. "Today's a bit different.
You'll see.
It's not about looking, it's about feeling, and sometimes feeling is far more complex than seeing." Morty nodded, recognizing that this was a lesson in patience, in noticing what could not be immediately observed, and in understanding that even in worlds constructed of the smallest parts, emotion and intention could shape everything. They moved through the lab together, stepping carefully over scattered notes and delicate devices, and Rick guided Morty toward a new section of the park. This part of Anatomy Park had been left deliberately unfinished, a quiet labyrinth of hallways and chambers designed to teach observation rather than impose instruction. Morty's pulse quickened, not from fear, but from the subtle thrill of anticipation. He knew that in these unpolished, quiet spaces, he would encounter truths that were less about spectacle and more about understanding, empathy, and attention. As they entered, the air seemed to shift slightly, carrying a faint warmth and a gentle hum of life that was almost imperceptible. Morty noticed immediately how the tiny inhabitants moved with more intention here, how the patterns of their activity suggested small dramas, delicate negotiations, and unspoken connections. He watched a miniature figure guide another across a narrow plank, and in that small gesture he felt an echo of human kindness. It struck him that even in worlds created artificially, the simplest actions carried weight, and that observing them closely allowed one to learn lessons far larger than appearances suggested. Rick stood silently beside him, watching Morty's reactions without interruption. Morty felt the familiar warmth of guidance in the quiet presence of Rick, understanding without words that growth often occurred in the unobserved, subtle moments. He leaned over a tiny street, noticing details he might have overlooked before, the precise angle of a bridge, the careful placement of a lantern, the way shadows curled around corners as if to protect what they contained. Every observation was a reminder that the world, no matter how small or strange, had rules, patterns, and rhythms, if one only paused long enough to notice them. Morty's mind wandered gently to the lessons embedded in these subtle moments. He thought about the importance of patience, of allowing things to unfold at their own pace, of seeing both the immediate and the distant consequences of even the smallest actions. There was a quiet bravery in this, an internal courage that required nothing more than presence, attentiveness, and care. He realized with a deepening sense of wonder that this bravery was as essential as any heroic feat he had read about or imagined. It was the courage of observation, of empathy, of quietly influencing the world without fanfare or recognition. They moved further into the labyrinth, and Morty's attention was drawn to a small chamber where a miniature network of pipes and bridges intertwined in a pattern both complex and harmonious. He traced the lines with his eyes, imagining the tiny lives that depended on each connection, each careful alignment. There was an unexpected beauty in the precision, in the delicate interdependence, and Morty felt a subtle resonance within himself. He understood, in a way that was more felt than reasoned, that the most profound understanding often emerged not from the obvious, but from noticing how small, seemingly insignificant elements intertwine to create balance, continuity, and meaning. Rick's voice broke through his reverie, soft yet deliberate. Morty, notice how each movement has impact. It's not always dramatic, but it's real. Even a small adjustment here can ripple outward. That's how life works too. You influence more than you realize, often without knowing it. Morty nodded, feeling the quiet weight of the words. He considered how many times he had acted or observed in his life without recognition, and yet those moments, subtle as they were, had shaped outcomes and relationships far more than any grand gesture could. It was a kind of invisible courage, a silent artistry of attention and care. The miniature inhabitants seemed to move with a life of their own, guided by unseen rules and subtle impulses, yet every action felt deliberate, meaningful, and consequential. Morty realized that even in a world constructed for observation, emotion, or entertainment, there existed patterns of interconnection that mirrored the broader truths of life. He noticed how one tiny figure paused to offer assistance to another, how a delicate bridge allowed for passage, and how even the smallest lights illuminated paths that might otherwise have remained dark. In these moments, Morty felt a profound kinship with the inhabitants and with Rick alike, a recognition that the essence of understanding and care transcended scale. As they wandered further, Morty felt a gentle melancholy rise alongside the quiet wonder. The park, with all its miniature streets and fragile constructions, reminded him that even beauty and intricacy were impermanent. Snowflakes, he thought, fell softly in the world outside, delicate and fleeting. Yet in their transient presence, they reshaped the landscape, revealed hidden textures, and invited contemplation. Similarly, the tiny acts within Anatomy Park, though ephemeral and unnoticed by the outside world, carried meaning, creating connections that endured far longer than the moment itself. Morty exhaled slowly, letting the awareness sink in, feeling the comforting rhythm of understanding and empathy settle within him. Rick guided him toward a small observation window where the entirety of the park could be seen in miniature splendor. Morty leaned lightly against the ledge, taking in the network of streets, bridges, and tiny figures moving purposefully. Felt a quiet swell of gratitude, not just for Rick, or for the park, or for the miniature inhabitants, but for the capacity to notice, to feel, and to engage with the subtle wonders around him. It was a gratitude that was inward, reflective, and profoundly calming. Morty understood that life's richness often lay hidden in plain sight, in the delicate balance of attention, empathy, and quiet action. The afternoon waned, and the world outside became a soft grey, the snow continuing its lazy descent. Morty felt a gentle exhaustion not from exertion, but from the deep engagement of mind and heart. He realized that lessons of empathy, subtle courage, and attentive observation were cumulative, like snow piling quietly into drifts, each layer, invisible on its own, but collectively capable of reshaping the landscape. He turned to Rick, feeling a soft reassurance in the familiar presence, understanding that growth required patience, reflection, and trust. As they exited the park and returned to the warmth of the house, Morty felt a serene sense of continuity. The quiet courage he had observed in miniature form mirrored the courage he could cultivate in his own life, the quiet heroism of noticing, caring, and acting with intention. Outside, the snow muffled the world into soft stillness, and Morty allowed himself to sink into the comfort of the moment. He understood, more fully than ever before, that life's most profound lessons often arrived subtly, gently, and without ceremony, and that the quiet acts of empathy and observation he practiced now would echo far beyond the immediate present. Morty settled into his chair by the window, the warmth of the room contrasting with the icy hush outside. He watched the falling snow, the faint glimmer of lights through the haze, and let the reflections of the day settle in his mind. He realized that growth, understanding, and quiet courage were cultivated not in grand gestures, but in small acts of attention, subtle kindness, and mindful observation. And in that realization, he felt a profound peace, a calm readiness to continue the journey, knowing that even the smallest steps taken thoughtfully could illuminate the path ahead. The night arrived slowly, folding the house into shadows that moved like whispers across the walls. Morty sat by the window, staring into the soft darkness outside, where the snow had begun to form small, glimmering drifts along the sidewalk. The air was still, carrying only the faint scent of pine and frost, and Morty felt a gentle hush settle over him, a sense that the world was both vast and intimate at the same time. He remembered the lessons of the past days, the quiet heroism of noticing, the subtle courage of small gestures, and he felt a tender anticipation for what lay ahead. Tonight felt different, though he couldn't yet name why. Rick entered quietly, carrying a small, softly glowing device. The light it emitted was warm, almost like the memory of a candle, and Morty felt the familiar shiver of curiosity and wonder as he followed Rick into the lab. There were no words at first, only the hum of machines and the subtle flicker of instruments that seemed to pulse in harmony with the snow outside. Rick's presence was calm but charged, a gentle signal that tonight's lessons would not be ordinary. Morty felt a flutter of something between excitement and reverence, the kind of sensation that arises when the boundaries of understanding
stretch, not violently, but like a gentle tide reshaping the shore.
Rick gestured toward a section of Anatomy Park that had remained unexplored, a series of narrow corridors and tiny chambers that seemed more like a hidden world than part of the park. "This," Rick said softly, "is where things start to feel different. It's not about sight, it's about sensing, feeling, and understanding. There's a rhythm here, Morty, and it isn't obvious. You'll need to notice the subtle currents, the faint pulses, the way things move when no one is watching." Morty nodded, feeling both the weight and the quiet thrill of responsibility. He knew that learning like this required patience, attention, and a willingness to trust the unseen. They moved together into the hidden chambers, the air warm but carrying a faint hum of life. Morty noticed immediately that the miniature inhabitants moved in slightly unpredictable patterns, their gestures more fluid, their actions imbued with a complexity that seemed almost alive. He realized with a mixture of awe and humility that this part of the park was not just a collection of structures, it was a living puzzle, a subtle test of perception, empathy, and careful observation. Morty's attention sharpened, and he felt a strange, quiet exhilaration at the thought that tonight, understanding would demand more than simple noticing. It would demand resonance, intuition, and care. Rick watched him with soft, steady eyes. "See that, Morty?" he whispered, pointing to a tiny figure helping another across a precarious bridge. "It's not just the act that matters, it's the intention behind it, the way it ripples outward. You can feel it if you pay attention. Life often speaks in subtle pulses, Morty, and sometimes the pulse is louder than the words." Morty leaned closer, focusing on the rhythm, the flow, the almost imperceptible shifts in movement and light. For the first time, he felt a faint stirring of what he would later call his own kind of intuition, a quiet, sensitive resonance with the world around him. As they continued, Morty noticed that some areas of the park were shrouded in dim light, almost like mist, and the inhabitants' movements there were slower, more deliberate. The air carried a faint vibration, a whisper of energy that Morty could sense without fully understanding. It made him feel alive in a different way, aware not just of what he saw, but of what the space itself seemed to communicate. He realized that observation alone was no longer sufficient. He needed to feel, to attune himself to the subtle cues and currents, to recognize significance in gestures that could easily be overlooked. Rick guided him gently, never rushing, allowing Morty's senses to expand at their own pace. "This is the part where you start to notice yourself noticing," Rick said, almost like a soft lullaby. "Your attention matters, your care matters. You're shaping your own rhythm here, Morty, even as you watch theirs." Morty felt a shiver of recognition. He had understood the world as observer and participant separately before, but now he sensed the delicate interplay between them. The way his awareness could shape, even slightly, the unfolding of events in ways both seen and unseen. In one chamber, a tiny inhabitant struggled with a bridge that wobbled under its weight. Morty instinctively reached out, not to touch, but to adjust a small lever that stabilized the structure. He watched as the figure crossed safely, and a faint pulse of warmth spread through him. It was a small act, almost imperceptible, yet profoundly meaningful. Rick's eyes softened, and Morty realized that he had begun to internalize the lesson of quiet influence, of subtle heroism. True courage, he understood, was measured not in grandeur, but in attentiveness, empathy, and action taken with intention. They moved deeper, the chambers becoming narrower, the corridors twisting like veins. Morty's focus sharpened, his senses attuned to tiny vibrations, the faintest shifts in light, the quiet signals of life moving around him. He realized that he could feel patterns forming, anticipate needs, sense unspoken connections. It was as if the park itself had become a teacher, guiding him to recognize the profound within the smallest gestures. Each movement, each choice of a miniature inhabitant, echoed outward in ways that Morty could almost perceive, and he felt an expanding awareness of the subtle influence of presence, care, and intention. A gentle warmth suffused the room as they approached the center of the hidden labyrinth. Morty felt a quiet awe, a reverent stillness, as though this chamber held the essence of everything he had learned so far. Tiny bridges, delicate pathways, and shimmering lights intertwined in a pattern that suggested both chaos and harmony, imperfection and design. Morty realized that understanding, empathy, and courage were not linear. They were woven like threads through a complex tapestry, each strand affecting the whole. He felt a surge of gratitude for the opportunity to witness and participate in this delicate balance, for the trust Rick had placed in him, and for the capacity to notice, to care, and to act. Rick's voice, gentle and measured, cut through the silence. "Morty, the lesson here isn't about doing. It's about being. Notice, feel, understand. Your presence itself can be a gift." Morty absorbed the words, letting them settle into his chest like a soft melody. He understood that mastery of the self, of perception, and of subtle courage was not measured in action alone, but in the quiet attention and empathy brought to each moment. The park was not just a miniature world. It was a reflection of life itself, a space where the invisible threads of care, intention, and resonance were made visible to those willing to perceive. As the night deepened, Morty felt a gentle fatigue, not of physical exertion, but of the mind and heart fully engaged. He realized that the lessons of subtle courage, empathy, and attentiveness were cumulative, building slowly, like the soft accumulation of snowflakes forming a silent, powerful drift. Outside, the snow continued to fall, silent and deliberate, and Morty exhaled slowly, feeling the quiet rhythm of the world settle into him. He felt finally that he was beginning to recognize the first signs of his own subtle power, the ability to sense, to care, and to influence in ways both quiet and profound. They returned to the warmth of the house, the faint hum of the lab and the soft glow of the window light providing comfort. Morty sank into a chair, letting the lessons of the evening, the wonder of the hidden park, and the soft pulse of understanding settle deeply within him. He realized that growth was not always visible, that courage could exist quietly, and that empathy and attention were forms of power in themselves. And as the night wrapped the house in a calm, soft embrace, Morty allowed himself to sink fully into the gentle awareness that he was learning not just to observe the world, but to feel it, influence it, and participate in it with care and intention. Morning broke with a soft, lingering light that filtered through the blinds, turning the dust motes in the air into tiny drifting stars. Morty awoke with a subtle thrill, the memory of last night's quiet revelation still pulsing in his chest like a heartbeat he could feel, but not see. The world outside seemed unusually still, yet charged with possibility, as if the snow and the hush of dawn had conspired to hold everything in a gentle suspension. Morty dressed slowly, savoring the warmth of his clothes and the familiar comfort of the routine, yet aware that today might shift everything in ways he could not yet anticipate. Rick was already in the lab, crouched over a tiny assembly of devices that hummed faintly with life. The faint glow of miniature lights reflected in his eyes, and Morty sensed the quiet satisfaction that comes from preparation. "Morning, Morty," Rick said softly, not looking up from his work. "Today's the day you'll start noticing more than before. Not just gestures, not just movements, but the pulse beneath them. You're ready to feel the rhythm, not just see it." Morty nodded, a warm flutter of anticipation rising in his chest. He had begun to recognize his own subtle senses, the quiet awareness that allowed him to perceive the tiny currents of life flowing around him, and he felt the first true stirrings of confidence in that growing ability. They moved toward Anatomy Park, the snow crunching softly beneath their boots. Morty felt the park differently this morning, not merely as a collection of structures, but as a living organism whose tiny inhabitants communicated not only through actions but through subtle currents he could almost sense. He paused, letting the rhythm of the park wash over him, and realized that yesterday's lessons, the power of presence, empathy, and observation, were beginning to manifest in him in new ways. He felt a gentle resonance with the miniature world, a quiet echo of the energy flowing through its streets and alleys, bridges and plazas. Rick led him to a previously unexplored corridor,
narrower than the rest, lit by faint, flickering lamps that cast delicate shadows across the walls.
Morty felt the first real stirrings of what he would come to understand as intuition, a soft, almost imperceptible awareness of the tiny events and movements taking place ahead of him. He could sense, before seeing, which bridges would need attention, which figures were about to interact, and which paths might lead to challenges. Rick watched him closely, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "You're starting to feel it, Morty. That's your power showing itself. Not a flashy one, but a quiet, steady one. It's subtle, but it matters." Morty felt a surge of warmth, a quiet pride mixed with reverence. The miniature inhabitants moved with a newfound rhythm, and he noticed, almost instinctively, where interventions might be helpful. In one narrow alley, a tiny figure teetered on the edge of a fragile bridge, unaware of the imbalance. Morty adjusted a delicate lever nearby, just enough to stabilize the structure. The figure crossed safely, and a soft sense of satisfaction settled in him. He realized then that the lessons of empathy, attention, and subtle courage were no longer abstract. They were becoming tangible abilities, quietly shaping his interactions with the world around him. They continued through the corridors, each twist and turn offering subtle opportunities for Morty to refine his perception. He noticed patterns he had missed before, the way light reflected off tiny surfaces to guide movement, the faint vibration signaling shifts in the inhabitants' behavior, the invisible threads of connection linking one figure to another. Morty felt a quiet awe, a reverent wonder that seemed to expand with each observation. The park was alive not merely in motion but in intention, and he was beginning to perceive the invisible currents of choice and consequence that ran through it like veins of light. Rick spoke rarely, only when Morty's attention wavered or when a lesson needed to be gently reinforced. The park isn't just objects and figures, Morty. It's a living system of interaction. You're learning to read the invisible. Most people don't notice, but noticing is power, subtle as it may be. Morty nodded, understanding that the quiet strength he was developing, attention, empathy, presence, was a form of heroism all its own. He felt the connection between himself and the park deepen, a sense that his awareness was both participant and observer, quietly shaping the flow of events in ways unseen yet significant. In one chamber, a miniature figure struggled to reach a distant platform, its movements hesitant and unsure. Morty felt a subtle tug in his chest, an unspoken prompt that guided his hands to adjust the environment. A tiny lever shifted, a bridge aligned, and the figure crossed safely. Morty exhaled, realizing the quiet impact of subtle action, and a warm sense of purpose settled within him. He understood, in a new and profound way, that heroism was not always visible, that courage could exist in observation and attentiveness, and that influence need not be grand to be meaningful. As they moved further into the hidden sections, Morty noticed that the park's energy shifted subtly. Some areas hummed more softly, others glimmered faintly with unexpected light. He followed the rhythm intuitively, sensing the pulse beneath the surface, feeling the faint threads connecting one space to another. His mind expanded in quiet wonder, absorbing the lessons without urgency, without judgment, simply attuning to the world and its delicate harmonies. Rick walked beside him, an unspoken affirmation of his growing abilities, letting Morty lead in subtle ways while remaining a steady anchor. Time seemed to fold and stretch in the quiet labyrinth. The outside world reduced to distant memory. Morty felt a gentle fatigue, not unpleasant, but a deep, meditative awareness of energy spent in growth, attention, and reflection. He recognized that these lessons, subtle as they were, required patience, practice, and quiet trust in the unseen. Each adjustment he made, each observation he followed, reinforced the invisible threads connecting him to the miniature world, and in turn, to his own expanding sense of purpose. In a small plaza near the center of the labyrinth, Morty paused to observe the interplay of light and shadow, the tiny figures moving with deliberate care. He felt a profound empathy, not just for the inhabitants, but for the larger principle they embodied, the significance of careful attention, deliberate action, and quiet courage. Morty understood that influence was not always loud, and that heroism could exist in subtlety, patience, and care. The park, in its intricate simplicity, reflected the delicate complexities of life itself, and Morty felt a sense of connection that was both humbling and exhilarating. Rick spoke softly, almost as if the words were meant for the park itself. "You're learning, Morty, not just to see, but to feel, not just to act, but to understand. This quiet strength is yours now, and it will guide you far more than any flashy gesture ever could." Morty felt the depth of meaning in those words, the gentle affirmation that growth, courage, and influence often manifest quietly, yet ripple outward in ways unseen but lasting. He exhaled slowly, letting the awareness settle in his chest, a warmth that spread gently through him. As the evening drew near, Morty realized he had become attuned not just to the inhabitants of the park, but to the rhythm of life itself, to the subtle currents of interaction, attention, and empathy. He felt a serene satisfaction, a soft confidence, and a quiet anticipation for the days to come. The lessons of subtle courage, quiet influence, and attentive observation were no longer theoretical. They were lived, experienced, and understood. And in that understanding, Morty felt a deep, peaceful resonance with the world, with Rick, and with himself, knowing that the quiet powers he had begun to cultivate would shape not only his journey through Anatomy Park, but the broader currents of his life. The morning light spilled softly into the lab, warm and gentle, filtering through the windows like liquid gold. Morty stirred awake, carrying the quiet satisfaction of yesterday's realizations tucked into the edges of his mind. He moved slowly, allowing the rhythm of the house to settle around him, feeling the lingering echo of subtle heroism and empathy that had begun to shape him. Today, he sensed, would be a day for the heart as much as for observation, a day where connection,
rather than mere perception, would reveal itself. Rick was already moving in the lab,
his hands guiding delicate instruments with care. Morty watched him for a moment, noting the small details, the tilt of his head as he studied a miniature structure, the soft hum of energy from a device that pulsed in response to the park itself. "Morning, Morty," Rick said quietly. "Today you're going to see how what you feel affects others.
Not just the park, not just the figures, but real connections.
You've started to notice the pulse of things. Now it's time to notice the pulse of hearts." Morty nodded, sensing the gentle weight of what Rick meant, a quiet anticipation fluttering in his chest. They stepped into Anatomy Park, the snow outside muffling the world, leaving the park's hidden chambers bathed in a soft, otherworldly light. Morty felt the familiar rhythm of the park, the pulse of miniature lives and tiny acts flowing beneath his awareness, but today there was a difference. The park seemed more alive, as though it knew he was becoming aware of the subtleties within it, responding to the quiet energy he brought with him. Every bridge, alley, and chamber carried a faint vibration, a whisper of connection that Morty felt deep in his chest. As they walked, Morty's thoughts drifted naturally to the people in his life beyond the park, his family, his friends, and the subtle, unspoken bonds he often took for granted. He realized that the lessons he had been learning here, careful observation, empathy, quiet courage, were the same lessons that shaped real relationships. Every gesture mattered, every act of attention was a kind of heroism, and the smallest movements could shift the tide of understanding between hearts. He felt a quiet warmth as he considered the unseen influence of his own presence in the lives of others. They approached a small plaza in the center of the park, where the inhabitants moved with their usual purposeful rhythm. Morty noticed a miniature figure struggling to reach a bridge, while another figure offered silent encouragement. Something inside him stirred, a new awareness that he could act not only to stabilize structures, but to guide and comfort, to nurture connection as carefully as he nurtured balance. He reached out, adjusting a tiny platform so the struggling figure could safely continue, and the sense of satisfaction was profound, calm, and deeply resonant. The pulse he had been sensing for days now extended beyond observation. It became participation in the life around him. Rick observed quietly, letting Morty's awareness blossom without interruption.
"See, Morty?"
he said softly.
"It's not always about doing.
Sometimes it's about being. Your care, your attention, your presence, Those ripple farther than any grand gesture. Morty nodded, the words sinking in like sunlight through frost. He began to understand that connection, like courage or empathy, was a subtle art requiring patience, attentiveness, and respect for the rhythm of those around him. Even in a miniature world, the principle was universal. Notice, care, act with intention, and let influence flow gently. A tiny figure, exhausted from navigating a narrow bridge, paused near the edge of a glowing chamber. Morty felt an intuitive nudge, a soft tug in his chest that guided him to adjust a nearby lever, tilting the surface just enough for safe passage. The figure crossed, and Morty exhaled slowly, feeling the quiet power of subtle intervention. He realized that these small acts of care, though easily overlooked, were profoundly significant. The world, he understood, moved in delicate threads of attention, empathy, and connection, and he was learning to trace those threads with awareness and grace. As they wandered deeper into the hidden corridors, Morty began to notice patterns of interaction that were more emotional than structural. Figures paused to encourage one another, shared fragile resources, or seemed to offer silent support. Morty felt each gesture ripple through him, a quiet affirmation that empathy and understanding were as tangible as any bridge or lever. He recognized that relationships, whether with friends, family, or the tiniest inhabitants, depended on noticing the small cues, responding with care, and acting with thoughtfulness. The lesson felt alive in his chest, as steady and sure as a heartbeat. Rick's voice cut softly through the ambient hum. Morty, you're starting to see it. The park isn't just miniature mechanics, it's miniature life.
And life is about relationships, about trust.
About listening with more than your ears and seeing with more than your eyes. Morty absorbed the words, letting them settle in the rhythm of his thoughts. He understood that the subtle power he had begun to cultivate, the ability to sense, empathize, and act, was not only practical, but deeply moral, a quiet form of integrity expressed in attention and care. In one chamber, two figures struggled to cross a swaying bridge together, hesitant and uncertain. Morty instinctively adjusted a support lever, just enough to steady the path without interfering with their autonomy. They crossed safely, and a soft warmth spread through Morty, the kind that comes from recognizing one's own capacity to influence outcomes gently and wisely. He realized that this was the essence of the quiet heroism Rick had been teaching him, subtle intervention, attuned to the needs of others, shaped not by impulse but by awareness and intention. They moved into a central hub of the park, where pathways converged, and Morty noticed the intricate dance of interdependence among the figures. Bridges, lights, and corridors intertwined like threads of a living tapestry. Morty felt the pulse of connection, the subtle hum of relationships unfolding. Each gesture, each movement contributed to the harmony of the whole. He understood that in life, as in the park, every choice mattered. Every observation could shape outcomes, and every act of care could ripple outward in unseen but powerful ways. Rick spoke again, softly and gently. Morty, you're ready for the next step. Not just noticing, not just helping, but understanding the weight of presence. What you bring into a space changes it, whether the space is big or small, real or imagined. And sometimes the most important work you do is unseen. Morty nodded slowly, feeling the truth of the words settle deep inside him. He understood that influence, empathy, and quiet courage were inseparable from the relationships he nurtured. Every bond mattered, every attentive act was a bridge, and every small gesture shaped more than he could immediately see. As the afternoon waned, Morty paused at a tiny balcony overlooking the central plaza of the park. He watched the figures move with purpose, noticing the smallest interactions, the subtle support systems, the quiet exchanges of trust and care. He felt a profound connection not just to the park but to the principle it embodied. Life is woven from relationships, attention, and empathy. Morty understood that his growing abilities, intuition, awareness, subtle influence, were gifts meant to strengthen connections, to honor care, and to cultivate understanding. Returning to the warmth of the house, Morty felt a gentle fatigue, a quiet satisfaction that came not from spectacle, but from mastery of subtlety. The lessons of the day, the resonance of presence, the careful nurturing of relationships, and the attentive engagement with life's pulse settled in his chest, warm and steady. He realized that the quiet heroism he practiced in the park mirrored the quiet heroism of daily life. Noticing, caring, acting with intention, and allowing influence to ripple in ways that may never be seen, yet are profoundly felt. Morty settled by the window as twilight approached, letting the calm snow outside mirror the stillness within. He reflected on the day, on the connections he had nurtured, and on the quiet power of empathy and presence. The park had taught him more than observation. It had shown him the weight of connection, the rhythm of influence, and the profound importance of subtle courage. And as the night wrapped the house in a soft embrace, Morty allowed himself to rest, carrying with him the serene understanding that relationships, care, and quiet attention were among life's most enduring and meaningful powers. The morning arrived in muted golds and soft shadows, the kind of light that seemed to stretch lazily across the world, carrying with it a sense of anticipation wrapped in calm. Morty awoke slowly, feeling the weight of last night's reflections nestle gently in his chest. The quiet lessons of empathy, attention, and subtle courage had become more than ideas. They were rhythms now tucked into his movements, his thoughts, his very awareness. Today, he sensed, would ask him to test those rhythms in ways that were at once delicate and profound. Rick was in the lab when Morty arrived.
Hands carefully adjusting instruments that glimmered with the faint hum of life.
"Morning, Morty," Rick said, in that soft, steady voice that carried reassurance without urgency. "Today you'll see how the world responds when your care is tested, not in spectacle, but in subtle, unexpected ways. You'll notice ripples you didn't expect, and you'll feel consequences in the quiet spaces." Morty nodded, feeling the familiar mixture of curiosity and reverence that always arose before the park revealed a new layer of understanding. They stepped into Anatomy Park, the snow outside continuing its gentle descent, blanketing the world in soft stillness. Morty felt the park differently today. There was an almost imperceptible tension in the miniature figure's movements, a quiet hint of struggle beneath the usual rhythm. He sensed, without fully understanding why, that these challenges were opportunities, subtle trials of his growing empathy and attentiveness. As he walked through narrow corridors and quiet chambers, the familiar pulse of the park felt more alive, more responsive, as though acknowledging his presence and the care he brought with him. Rick led him toward a series of bridges and tunnels that he had not yet explored. Morty noticed immediately that the movements of the miniature inhabitants were slightly irregular, as if they were unsure or hesitant. His chest stirred with a gentle ache of concern, and he realized that these were the first true tests of his ability to perceive and respond to emotional cues, not merely physical ones. One tiny figure struggled to cross a swaying bridge, its motions hesitant and trembling. Morty's intuition nudged him toward subtle intervention, a soft adjustment to a nearby support lever, and he felt a quiet thrill when the figure crossed safely. The satisfaction was not loud or triumphant. It was a calm acknowledgement of influence and care, subtle yet deeply resonant. As they moved deeper into the park, Morty began to sense a pattern. The challenges were less about mechanics and more about relationships, small crises that tested the patience, empathy, and attentiveness of those who observed. A miniature pair of figures hesitated to share a resource, one retreating slightly while the other waited silently. Morty felt the faint tug of understanding in his chest and instinctively nudged a small platform to balance their access. The figures interacted successfully, and Morty exhaled, feeling the quiet satisfaction of intervention aligned with care. He understood that these lessons were preparing him not for grand heroics, but for the subtler, enduring work of connection and trust. Rick watched him closely, a faint approving smile tugging at his lips. "See, Morty? This is the real test. Not rushing in, not fixing everything, but guiding. Subtle influence aligned with empathy and awareness. The quietest acts often carry the most weight." Morty nodded slowly, absorbing the lesson in the rhythm of his chest and the gentle hum of the park around him. He felt a deeper attunement, a delicate sensitivity to the needs of others, both miniature and otherwise, and he realized that influence was not measured in grandeur, but in resonance. A small figure teetered near a delicate bridge in another chamber. Morty's pulse quickened, not from fear, but from the awareness that this time the solution required more than instinct. He paused, sensing the hesitation of the figure, the faint vibrations of uncertainty, the subtle cues in the posture and movement. Slowly, deliberately, he adjusted a tiny rail to provide balance without removing the figure's autonomy. The figure crossed safely, and Morty felt a quiet surge of pride, tempered by humility. The act was small, almost invisible, yet profoundly significant in its reflection of patience, empathy, and discernment. They continued through the labyrinthine corridors, encountering challenges that required Morty to balance intervention with observation, care with restraint. He began to notice subtle emotional cues, the slight hesitation in a miniature figure's step, the gentle pull of trust between two others, the invisible threads connecting them. Morty realized that his growth was not just in noticing, but in feeling, in letting intuition guide careful action without overstepping. The park, alive with these lessons, felt like a living meditation on empathy, patience, and the quiet artistry of influence. Rick spoke quietly, almost as if sharing a secret with the room itself. "Morty, you're learning the most important lesson here. Influence without arrogance.
Care without need for recognition.
That's the quiet courage that shapes worlds, big or small." Morty nodded, letting the words settle into him. He felt the first real understanding that heroism often lies not in grand gestures, but in attentive presence, in listening, in small acts that ripple outward in unseen but enduring ways. In a small plaza near the park's center, a cluster of figures struggled to coordinate across a series of narrow bridges. Morty sensed the tension between them, subtle and human despite their miniature forms. He adjusted platforms and levers with gentle precision, balancing risk and support without overtaking the figures' agency. The figures completed their passage successfully, and Morty felt a warm pulse of satisfaction, the deep resonance of subtle heroism. He realized that his growing abilities, the intuition, empathy, and quiet influence he had cultivated, were beginning to function together, harmonizing in ways that were both graceful and powerful. As the afternoon deepened, Morty found a quiet corner to reflect. He watched the gentle flow of interaction, the care and hesitation, the small triumphs and collaborative efforts. He understood that relationships, whether miniature or real, required constant attention and thoughtful engagement. Even tiny acts of care could ripple outward, influencing more than he could immediately perceive. The park was a mirror, showing him not only the consequences of action, but the subtle shaping of trust, attention, and intention. Rick remained nearby, speaking occasionally, guiding without intruding. Morty noticed the weight of presence. Your care matters.
Even when no one sees it.
And sometimes the smallest acts of courage, patience, or empathy are the ones that shape the world the most. Morty felt the depth of those words, the gentle confirmation of his growing understanding. The lessons of yesterday and today merged, forming a quiet confidence. He could act subtly, care deeply, and influence the flow of life in ways that mattered, even without recognition. As evening approached, Morty felt a gentle fatigue, a quiet satisfaction,
and an expanding sense of connection to the park, to Rick,
and to the principles he had begun to internalize. The challenges he had faced today, though subtle, had tested his perception, patience, and empathy. He realized that growth required attention to both the visible and the invisible, the mechanical and the emotional, the immediate and the long-lasting. Even the smallest adjustments could foster trust, understanding, and courage, and Morty felt the quiet power of influence in the rhythm of his heart. Returning to the warmth of the house, Morty settled by the window, watching the snow fall in slow, deliberate flakes. The quiet reflections of the day flowed gently through his mind, the small triumphs, the subtle interventions, the soft hum of connections made and nurtured. He felt the resonance of the lessons settle deep within him, a warm, steady understanding that quiet heroism, empathy, and attentive presence were as vital in life as any spectacular achievement. And as the night enveloped the house, Morty exhaled softly, feeling the calm, steady pulse of growth, care, and subtle courage that would guide him through whatever lay ahead. The morning arrived with a fragile light, soft and golden, spilling through the blinds and casting quiet shadows across the lab. Morty awoke slowly, carrying the gentle residue of yesterday's realizations in his chest. The subtle rhythm of empathy, observation, and careful influence was no longer a concept, but a tangible part of him, like a breath he could feel but not see. Today, he sensed, would stretch those abilities in ways both quiet and intricate,
asking him to trust not only his perception,
but the deeper awareness that had been growing within him. Rick was already at his workbench, moving with a quiet focus that made the usual hum of machinery feel almost like a lullaby. "Morning, Morty," Rick said softly, without looking up.
Today things get a bit more tangled. Not dangerous, not loud, just delicate.
You'll need to trust what you feel as much as what you see. You'll notice currents you didn't realize existed, and you'll need to respond in ways that aren't obvious. Morty nodded, feeling a flutter of anticipation in his chest. The park had become a living teacher, and he was beginning to realize that learning its lessons required patience, trust, and emotional attentiveness as much as curiosity. They stepped into Anatomy Park, the snow outside muffling the world into a quiet, almost sacred hush. Morty felt the familiar pulse of the park, the subtle vibrations of miniature lives unfolding. But today, it was richer, deeper, layered with interactions and dependencies he had not noticed before. Tiny figures moved with hesitation, uncertainty, and purpose, creating a delicate network of actions that Morty sensed rather than observed. Each step, each gesture seemed charged with significance, as though the park itself was aware of his growing awareness. Interventions were often quiet, almost imperceptible, yet deeply consequential. In one chamber, two miniature figures hesitated to share a fragile resource. Morty sensed the tension, the unspoken fear of imbalance or loss, and the gentle push of intuition guided him to subtly adjust the environment, allowing both to access what they needed without forcing the outcome. The figures moved successfully, their interactions flowing with a newfound ease. Morty felt a warmth in his chest, the profound satisfaction of facilitating understanding without overt control. He realized that heroism could exist quietly, in the attentive harmonizing of needs and the careful nurturing of trust. The corridors twisted and narrowed, offering challenges that demanded Morty's perception and emotional sensitivity simultaneously. A figure teetered on a delicate bridge, another waiting patiently, and Morty felt the combined rhythm of anticipation, hesitation, and subtle communication. He adjusted the balance with care, allowing the figures to act without overriding their agency. The success of these interventions was not celebrated loudly. Instead, it resonated softly within Morty, a confirmation of his growing understanding that the most powerful acts often left no visible trace, yet shaped outcomes profoundly, Rick observed quietly, letting Morty's intuition guide him while offering occasional, gentle reinforcement. Notice how the park responds, Morty. It's not just about solving problems, it's about understanding the flow of interaction, the subtle exchanges, the trust that forms when care is applied with restraint. Morty nodded, sensing the layers of connection, trust, and mutual influence among the inhabitants. He realized that these lessons extended far beyond the park, reflecting how attention, empathy, and subtle action shaped relationships in the broader world. A central hub of the park revealed the complexity of these interdependencies. Figures moved in delicate synchrony across bridges and platforms, small acts of care supporting one another in unseen ways. Morty felt the rhythm of their interactions, the faint pulses of trust and encouragement that bound them together. He understood, in a way that was felt rather than thought, that even minor interventions could ripple outward, fostering stability, confidence, and connection. He acted with care, guiding gently without imposing, and felt the deep resonance of quiet heroism. As the afternoon stretched, Morty paused at a balcony overlooking a glowing plaza. He watched the figures interact, noticing the subtle hesitations, the encouragement offered silently, and the delicate interplay of trust. He felt the quiet power of presence, the understanding that attention, empathy, and small acts of care could shape more than brute effort ever could. Morty realized that the park was teaching him the rhythm of life itself, that the influence we exert is most enduring when applied gently, attentively, and with consideration. Rick spoke softly beside him. Morty, the challenges today weren't about doing. They were about being aware, being present, being attuned. That's the kind of courage that lasts. Morty exhaled slowly, letting the words settle. He recognized that the quiet heroism he was cultivating, the combination of intuition, empathy, and subtle influence, was a skill that extended far beyond the miniature world of Anatomy Park. It was a principle that could guide him through life, shaping his interactions, his relationships, and his understanding of the world. Evening arrived with a delicate hush, the light fading to soft greys and blues. Morty felt a calm fatigue, the kind that comes from fully engaging both heart and mind. He reflected on the day's lessons, subtle influence, careful observation, empathy, and the quiet shaping of relationships. He understood that growth was cumulative, a slow unfolding of awareness and attention, and that true impact often left no immediate mark, but could ripple through lives in ways both profound and enduring. Returning to the house, Morty settled by the window, watching the snow drift in slow, deliberate patterns. He felt the rhythm of the park lingering within him, the pulse of trust, care, and attentive presence echoing quietly. The challenges of the day, subtle as they were, had stretched him, revealing the quiet strength he had been cultivating. Morty exhaled, allowing the calm, meditative energy to settle deep in his chest, carrying with it the serene understanding that subtle courage, empathy, and awareness were gifts that shaped not only miniature worlds, but life itself. And as the night wrapped the house in soft shadows, Morty felt the quiet resonance of his growing abilities, the gentle power of attentiveness and care, and the warm assurance that even the smallest gestures could leave lasting ripples. The park, Rick, and the lessons of subtle heroism rested with him, guiding him forward in calm, steady rhythms. Morty leaned back, letting the day's experiences settle, feeling both humility and quiet pride, ready for whatever gentle challenges awaited tomorrow. Morning arrived with a soft hush, the light brushing the edges of the lab in muted golds and gentle blues. Morty awoke slowly, the rhythm of the previous days still echoing softly in his chest. The quiet pulse of empathy, subtle influence, and attentive care that had begun to shape him. Today, he sensed, would be about connection in a different way, not only with the park and its miniature inhabitants, but with the deeper threads of relationships that had always intertwined with his life. There was an anticipation that was calm yet profound, like the first stirring of wind across a still lake. Rick was already at the workbench, hands moving with a quiet deliberation, adjusting instruments that hummed softly in response to the park's subtle energy. "Morning, Morty," Rick said in his low, steady voice. "Today, the park will teach you about bonds, the invisible ones, the ones that hold spaces and hearts together. You're going to notice more than movement today. You're going to notice intention, hesitation, and trust." Morty nodded, feeling the warmth of understanding settle over him. He had grown attuned to the pulse of the miniature world, and now he began to sense the resonance of connections that were emotional, delicate, and sometimes unspoken. They stepped into Anatomy Park, the snow outside casting a soft, serene quiet over everything, making the world feel intimate, suspended. Morty felt the park differently this morning. There was a rhythm in the figures' interactions, a subtle dance of encouragement, hesitancy, and trust that seemed almost human in its complexity. He recognized that the lessons of observation and subtle intervention were evolving into a more intricate practice, recognizing emotional currents, responding with care, and understanding that influence is as much about patience as it is about action. As they moved through narrow corridors and swaying bridges, Morty noticed a miniature pair struggling to cross a particularly fragile pathway. One figure hesitated while the other reached silently in encouragement. Morty felt the tug of awareness in his chest, an intuitive nudge guiding him to adjust a support lever just enough to stabilize the bridge. The figures crossed safely, their tiny gestures of trust and gratitude resonating within Morty like a quiet song. He understood that these acts, though subtle, were profound, shaping trust, fostering cooperation, and teaching him about the delicate power of presence in relationships, Rick observed, offering occasional guidance without interrupting. "See, Morty,
Influence isn't always about fixing problems.
sometimes it's about listening with more than your ears, seeing with more than your eyes. Relationships, even in miniature, are about attention and care." Morty absorbed the words, allowing the lesson to settle into his chest. He realized that heroism was not always visible or dramatic. It existed in attentiveness, in small gestures, in the quiet fostering of trust and understanding. They reached a central chamber where several figures were attempting to coordinate across a series of bridges and platforms. Hesitation rippled among them, subtle cues of uncertainty and unspoken tension. Morty felt the rhythm of their interactions, the faint pulse of trust and hesitation weaving through the space. He adjusted a few elements gently, providing balance without overriding the figures' autonomy, and watched as they moved together successfully. A soft warmth spread through him, a recognition of the impact that careful attention, empathy, and subtle action could create. As they progressed further, Morty noticed patterns in the park that mirrored human relationships: encouragement, hesitation, patience, and care, interweaving like threads in an invisible tapestry. Small conflicts arose. A figure misjudged a bridge, another hesitated to share a resource, but Morty's subtle interventions helped to ease the tension. He realized that these lessons were not just about mechanics. They were about emotional literacy, about sensing and nurturing trust, patience, and cooperation. Each successful interaction left him with a quiet, reflective satisfaction, the kind that expands gently within the chest and settles into the heart. Rick's voice came softly as they moved through a dim corridor. Morty, notice how the park mirrors the patterns you see in real relationships. Hesitation, trust, encouragement, they're everywhere. What you're learning isn't just about miniature figures. It's about empathy, presence, and subtle influence. Morty nodded, absorbing the words in a meditative way. He felt a growing clarity that the quiet heroism he had cultivated was deeply entwined with understanding, patience, and emotional resonance, not just observation or action. In a small plaza near the center, a pair of figures struggled to coordinate on a narrow walkway. Morty sensed the tension, the unspoken fear of failure or imbalance, and felt an intuitive nudge to create subtle adjustments. He aligned the bridge just enough to give them stability without overtly guiding their steps. The figures moved with newfound confidence, and Morty exhaled, feeling the quiet power of careful intervention. He understood that trust and support, even when unseen, could shape outcomes in ways that mattered profoundly. As the afternoon deepened, Morty found a quiet balcony overlooking the glowing center of the park. He watched interactions unfold, the gestures of cooperation, the hesitant pauses, the gentle encouragements, and felt a profound resonance with the lessons of subtle heroism and emotional literacy. He realized that influence was not measured in dramatic gestures, but in the quiet, careful cultivation of trust, attention, and care. The park, alive with these lessons, felt like a meditation on connection, patience, and the delicate interweaving of lives. Rick spoke softly beside him, as if sharing a secret with both Morty and the park. Morty, today isn't about success or failure. It's about noticing the threads that bind us, about seeing and responding with care. The strongest bonds are often invisible, held together by attention, trust, and empathy. Morty nodded, feeling the truth of those words settle deep in his chest. He understood that relationships like the miniature park required both presence and restraint, observation and subtle intervention. The most meaningful impacts often left no visible mark, yet shaped the course of life quietly and profoundly. Evening arrived, bringing a gentle hush to the park. Morty felt a quiet fatigue tempered by a deep, reflective satisfaction. He had spent the day observing, intervening, and attuning himself to the subtle currents of trust, hesitation, and care. The challenges had tested both perception and emotional acuity, teaching him that the quiet heroism he cultivated depended as much on patience and empathy as on action. He understood that relationships, whether miniature or real, were delicate ecosystems that flourished under careful attention and thoughtful presence. Returning to the warmth of the house, Morty settled by the window, watching the snow drift lazily outside. He reflected on the day's lessons, on the small interventions that had nurtured trust and cooperation, and on the quiet satisfaction of shaping outcomes through empathy and attention. He felt the rhythm of subtle heroism pulse gently within him, a steady, meditative resonance that would guide him in the days to come. The park, Rick, and the lessons of connection and influence lingered, a quiet affirmation of the enduring power of care, patience, and attentive presence. As night embraced the house in soft shadows, Morty allowed the reflections of the day to settle fully. The quiet heroism, the emotional attunement, and the subtle influence he had cultivated resonated within him, forming a gentle, steady heartbeat of understanding. He exhaled, feeling the calm and reflective satisfaction of growth, the quiet confidence that the smallest gestures, guided by empathy and attentiveness, could ripple through life in profound, lasting ways. And as the snow continued to fall, Morty felt at peace, ready for the unfolding days, carrying with him the knowledge that subtle acts of care and connection were among the most powerful forces in any world. The first light of morning filtered through the blinds with a gentle patience, spilling across the lab in muted streaks of gold and blue. Morty stirred, feeling the quiet echo of days spent learning, observing, and nurturing subtle courage. The rhythm of empathy and attentiveness had become a part of him, a soft undercurrent that shaped how he noticed the world and responded to it. Today, he sensed, would be a day of integration, where all the lessons of observation, subtle influence, and emotional resonance would converge, offering him a chance to truly inhabit the quiet heroism he had been cultivating. Rick was already moving among the instruments, the soft hum of the devices almost melodic in its consistency. "Morning, Morty," Rick said, his voice low and calm. "Today, the park will show you how all the lessons come together. Observation, empathy, subtle influence, they're not separate things anymore. You'll see how one careful choice can ripple through connections, shaping outcomes in ways both visible and unseen." Morty nodded, a gentle anticipation settling in his chest. He had grown to trust the rhythm of the park, the quiet lessons embedded in every corridor, every bridge, every tiny interaction, and now he felt ready to see them converge. As they stepped into Anatomy Park, the snow outside lay thick and still, muffling sound and creating a suspended, contemplative atmosphere. Morty felt the park differently today, alive not only with miniature motion, but with an almost tangible flow of connection. Every figure, every bridge, every chamber seemed part of a living network of subtle interactions. He noticed hesitation, encouragement, and trust moving through the tiny inhabitants like currents, and he realized that today he would need to navigate the invisible threads that connected them all. They moved through familiar corridors, the rhythm of the park now resonating with Morty's own growing sense of awareness. A small figure struggled to cross a fragile bridge while another paused nearby, offering silent support. Morty felt the familiar nudge of intuition, but today he noticed something deeper. The interconnectedness of actions and reactions, the delicate balance of influence and autonomy. He adjusted a lever gently, stabilizing the bridge just enough to allow safe passage while letting the figures maintain their own agency. The sense of quiet accomplishment that followed was richer than ever, a soft hum of connection and trust resonating in his chest. Rick observed without interruption, his presence calm and steady. "Notice how the park responds, Morty. It's not about doing for them, it's about being attuned, about understanding the flow of interaction and influence. The strongest impact comes when care is applied with awareness, patience, and subtlety." Morty absorbed the words in a meditative way, recognizing the depth of their truth. The park was not only a miniature world, it was a mirror of the delicate currents of real life, where influence and care, when applied thoughtfully, shaped outcomes more profoundly than spectacle ever could. In the central chamber, multiple figures were navigating a complex series of bridges and narrow platforms. Hesitation, encouragement, and trust interwove in subtle patterns. Morty felt the pulse of these interactions as if it were a living rhythm, and he understood that his actions could either support or disrupt that flow. He moved carefully, balancing levers and adjusting platforms with quiet precision. The figures coordinated successfully, their movements flowing like a gentle, intricate dance, and Morty felt a deep satisfaction in the resonance of his influence, a quiet harmony created through empathy, awareness, and subtle guidance. As they moved deeper into the park, Morty noticed more complex emotional currents at play, hesitation mixed with confidence, encouragement paired with uncertainty, trust fragile but resilient. He sensed that these currents were not isolated. They intertwined, creating networks of influence that extended beyond immediate observation. Morty's interventions became more nuanced, guided not only by instinct, but by a growing understanding of patterns, relationships, and emotional balance. He realized that influence, when applied thoughtfully, could ripple across these networks, shaping outcomes with care and wisdom. Rick's voice broke the soft hum of the park, calm and deliberate. "Morty, notice how everything you've learned, observation, empathy, subtle action, now converges. The impact of one thoughtful intervention can cascade through connections you might never fully see. That's the power of awareness, presence, and quiet courage." Morty nodded, feeling the weight of the lessons settle gently within him. He understood that the quiet heroism he had been practicing was no longer a series of discrete skills. It was a way of inhabiting the world, a rhythm of presence and attentiveness that could shape lives in meaningful, lasting ways. In a narrow passageway, two miniature figures hesitated over a fragile bridge, while a third offered silent encouragement. Morty felt the delicate balance of tension, trust, and support, and he acted with gentle precision, adjusting a platform to allow safe passage without undermining autonomy. The figures moved successfully, and Morty exhaled slowly, feeling a profound satisfaction in the quiet orchestration of connection. He recognized that even the smallest gestures, subtle adjustments, moments of attentiveness could create ripples of trust and understanding that extended far beyond immediate perception. As the afternoon deepened, Morty paused at a balcony overlooking the central plaza of the park. He watched the intricate network of figures navigating bridges and corridors, noticing hesitation, encouragement, and trust weaving through the space like invisible threads. He felt a resonance within himself, a quiet alignment with the park's rhythm. Morty realized that subtle influence, empathy, and careful attention were not only skills to be applied, they were ways of inhabiting the world, of shaping it with awareness, care,
and intention. Rick stood beside him, quiet but present.
Morty, today shows you how all the lessons converge. The impact of subtle heroism isn't in grand gestures, it's in the flow of relationships, in the quiet cultivation of trust and understanding. What you do, even when unseen, matters deeply. Morty absorbed the words, feeling a calm certainty in the rhythm of his chest. He understood that his growth, his careful attentiveness, and his ability to perceive and respond thoughtfully were all part of a greater understanding of connection and influence. Evening descended, casting a gentle hush over the park. Morty felt a reflective fatigue, a soft contentment that came from fully engaging both heart and mind. He thought of the figures, the connections, and the invisible threads that he had navigated today. The lessons of subtle intervention, empathy, and awareness had coalesced into a quiet, steady confidence, a knowledge that the smallest acts, when guided by care and presence, could ripple outward with enduring impact. Returning to the warmth of the house, Morty settled by the window, watching the snow drift in slow, deliberate patterns. He reflected on the day's unfolding, on the integration of skills and awareness, and on the quiet satisfaction of shaping outcomes through attentiveness and empathy. He felt the rhythm of subtle heroism resonate within him, steady and meditative, a soft pulse that would guide him in the days to come. The park, Rick, and the lessons of connection, patience, and care lingered in his chest, a gentle affirmation of the enduring power of quiet attention. As night embraced the house, Morty allowed the reflections of the day to settle fully. He felt the harmony of empathy, observation, and subtle influence pulse softly in him. Even the smallest gestures, applied with awareness and care, could ripple through the delicate webs of connection, shaping outcomes in ways that mattered profoundly. Morty exhaled, the calm satisfaction of integrated understanding washing over him. The quiet heroism he had cultivated, the patient observation, and the gentle influence he now carried were a meditation in themselves, a rhythm that would accompany him, softly and enduringly, into whatever days awaited. The morning light arrived soft and diffuse, spilling across the lab like a gentle promise. Morty woke slowly, feeling the calm weight of the previous day's lessons resting within him. The quiet rhythm of subtle heroism, empathy, and attentive presence had become a part of his being, not just a set of skills he applied, but a way of moving through the world. Today felt different, less a test, more reflection, a chance to see how all the strands of growth, observation, and quiet influence wove together into a tapestry of understanding. Rick was already at the bench, tinkering with a small mechanism that emitted a soft hum. "Morning, Morty," he said, voice low and deliberate. "Today, you'll see how influence and care echo over time. The park will show you that what you do, what you nurture quietly, ripples farther than you realize." Morty nodded, feeling a familiar warmth in his chest. The park had taught him about patience, perception, and subtle intervention. But today he sensed that the lessons would be more reflective, revealing the long arcs of trust, care, and connection. They stepped into Anatomy Park, the snow outside falling in gentle, muffled sheets. Morty felt the park differently today, not just as a space to act, but as a living reflection of the lessons he had internalized. The figures moved with their usual rhythm, but now Morty noticed the subtleties: hesitation softened by encouragement, trust built incrementally, moments of quiet patience blossoming into cooperation. The park felt like a quiet meditation on connection, each movement a gentle ripple through an intricate web of relationships. As they walked through familiar corridors, Morty observed a miniature figure paused on a delicate bridge, uncertainty etched into its tiny posture. Another figure lingered behind, offering silent support. Morty felt the familiar tug of intuition, but this time he acted differently. He simply observed first, letting the figures navigate with minimal adjustment, only guiding when it became necessary. The result was smoother than before. The figures crossed safely, their interactions carrying a subtle harmony that resonated within Morty. He understood that sometimes the quietest presence, the gentle watchfulness, could have the most profound effect. Rick's voice came softly, almost blending with the hum of the park.
"See that, Morty?
Sometimes care is not about action, but about awareness. You've grown to recognize the currents, the subtle interactions, and now you can step in, or step back, at the right time. That's real mastery." Morty nodded, letting the words settle into his chest. The park had become not only a place of observation, but a mirror for life itself, teaching him that trust, patience, and attentiveness could ripple outward in ways both seen and unseen. They moved toward the central plaza, where multiple figures coordinated across narrow platforms and bridges. Morty felt the rhythm of hesitation and encouragement, trust and uncertainty, weaving together like threads in a complex tapestry. He adjusted supports and levers gently, intervening with care but leaving autonomy intact. The figures moved together with increasing confidence and grace. Morty felt the satisfaction of quiet orchestration, the deep understanding that influence and empathy, applied thoughtfully, could harmonize even the most delicate of systems. As the afternoon wore on, Morty began to notice subtle echoes of previous days, small interactions now unfolding naturally because of interventions made earlier. Trust had taken root, hesitation was softened by encouragement, and cooperation flowed with a rhythm that seemed almost alive. He realized that the park was revealing the long-term effects of patience, empathy, and quiet guidance, how seemingly small acts, when applied consistently, could shape outcomes far beyond immediate perception. Rick watched him quietly. "Morty, this is the essence of what you've learned. Influence is not instant. Trust grows slowly, connection deepens over time, and the impact of your care, even when subtle, can resonate for much longer than you imagine." Morty felt the weight of the truth in those words. He had spent days learning the mechanics of intervention, the subtleties of perception, and the quiet artistry of empathy. Today, he was seeing how those lessons unfolded across time, creating patterns of trust, cooperation, and subtle heroism that extended far beyond his immediate actions. In a quiet corner of the park, a cluster of figures struggled with a shared task. Morty felt the delicate interplay of hesitation, encouragement, and silent coordination. He intervened only as necessary, guiding subtly and allowing space for initiative. The figures completed the task successfully, their interactions flowing with a gentle rhythm. Morty exhaled slowly, feeling a deep resonance of quiet pride. He understood that influence, when applied with care and attention, created effects that persisted, subtly shaping the dynamics of trust and collaboration in ways that were deeply meaningful. As evening approached, Morty paused at a balcony overlooking the glowing heart of the park. He observed the intricate networks of interaction, the subtle ebb and flow of cooperation, and the quiet hum of trust taking root. He reflected on the cumulative lessons of days past, the patience of observation, the careful interventions, the subtle guidance, and the cultivation of empathy. Everything had converged into a quiet understanding that heroism was often invisible, influence was subtle, and true connection required both presence and restraint. Rick spoke softly beside him. Morty, the park is showing you what you've been cultivating all along. Quiet attention, empathy, subtle influence. These are not just skills, they are ways of being. What you've learned here isn't about control. It's about presence, care, and the ripples that unfold over time. Morty nodded, letting the words settle gently. He felt the harmony of past lessons, interventions, and reflections converge into a steady pulse within him. A quiet, enduring confidence that the small, thoughtful acts he performed mattered far beyond what was immediately visible. Night descended, bathing the park in soft, gentle shadows. Morty felt a calm satisfaction, a reflective serenity born from fully engaging with the rhythms of connection and care. He thought of the figures, their hesitations, encouragements, and small triumphs, and he felt the quiet satisfaction of seeing the long-term effects of patient, attentive presence. The lessons of the park, now internalized, resonated deeply.
A gentle pulse of understanding, empathy,
and subtle heroism that would guide him well beyond the miniature corridors and bridges of Anatomy Park. Returning to the warmth of the house, Morty settled by the window, snow drifting lazily outside. He reflected on the day's experiences, on the cumulative impact of subtle interventions, and on the quiet, enduring influence of patience and care. He felt the rhythm of subtle heroism settling within him, a meditative pulse of empathy and presence that could ripple outward, shaping connections and outcomes long after the immediate moment had passed. The park, Rick, and the lessons of trust and connection lingered in him, a soft affirmation of the enduring power of quiet attentiveness. As night fully embraced the house, Morty let the reflections of the day settle fully into his heart. The quiet mastery of empathy, observation, and subtle influence had become part of him, a rhythm he could carry into life itself. He exhaled, feeling a calm satisfaction, a gentle awareness that small, deliberate gestures of care and attention could ripple through the world in meaningful ways. And in the soft hush of night, Morty allowed himself to rest, knowing that the quiet heroism he had cultivated would continue to shape both miniature worlds and the vast, unseen currents of life beyond. The morning arrived with a tender quiet, the kind that feels like the world itself is pausing to breathe. Morty stirred slowly, aware of the rhythm of his own heartbeat, the soft pulse of lessons learned and experiences gathered. The park, the miniature figures, Rick's quiet guidance, all of it had settled into a steady resonance within him. Today there was no urgency, no challenge demanding immediate action. Instead, there was reflection, the gentle unfolding of understanding, and the quiet preparation for a closing chapter in both his experience and his heart. Rick was at the workbench, tinkering with a device that hummed softly, the sound blending seamlessly with the quiet ambience of the morning. "Morning, Morty," Rick said in his low, calm voice. "Today it's not about action, not about problem-solving. Today it's about reflection, about seeing the threads of connection you've nurtured. You'll notice how patience, empathy, and subtle influence echo in ways you didn't see before." Morty nodded, feeling a soft warmth in his chest. The park had always been a teacher, but now it felt like a mirror, reflecting not only growth, but the subtle beauty of what he had become capable of noticing, caring, and shaping with restraint. They entered Anatomy Park, the snow outside falling like a muted curtain, softening sound and light, creating a quiet, almost sacred atmosphere. Morty felt the park differently today, not as a space of action, but as a reflection of time and connection. Figures moved with familiar rhythms, yet each movement carried echoes of the interventions Morty had made over the previous days. Hesitation was softened by encouragement, trust had taken root, and cooperation flowed with a quiet elegance that seemed almost alive. Morty realized that today's lesson was about noticing the ripple effects of care and attentiveness over time. As they walked through the corridors, Morty paused to observe a miniature figure hesitating at a bridge, while another lingered nearby offering silent support. Instead of acting immediately, Morty simply watched, sensing the intricate rhythm of trust and interaction. He noticed how the hesitation and encouragement mirrored patterns he had seen before, but now carried the subtle influence of prior guidance. He allowed the figures to navigate on their own, intervening only in the tiniest adjustments, and watched as they crossed successfully. A gentle satisfaction settled over him, the quiet knowledge that patience, attention, and empathy could shape outcomes even when applied long ago, echoing through the fabric of interaction. Rick's voice cut through softly, blending with the hum of the park. "See that, Morty? Influence isn't always immediate. Sometimes it lingers, waiting for the right moment to blossom. The echoes of your care ripple through time. That's a rare kind of power." Morty nodded, feeling the truth of the words settle like a soft stone in his chest. The park had become not just a place of learning, but a meditation on the enduring effects of empathy, attentiveness, and subtle guidance. In the central plaza, multiple figures moved across bridges and platforms, coordinating with increasing ease. Morty noticed how previous hesitations had dissolved into confidence, how encouragements given in the past had grown into trust, and how subtle interventions had created networks of cooperation that now functioned independently. Morty realized that the park was showing him the long-term impact of consistent care, how patience, observation, and subtle guidance could ripple through the smallest details, forming a delicate web of connection that was stronger than any dramatic act could achieve. Rick watched quietly, allowing Morty to absorb the lessons. "Morty, this is what you've been cultivating. Quiet presence, attentiveness, and subtle influence. The echoes you leave are what shape lasting connections. The park, these figures, they're showing you that the care you put in isn't lost. It persists in ways you might never directly observe." Morty exhaled slowly, feeling the resonance of Rick's words. He understood, in a way that was both meditative and profound, that the quiet heroism he had developed was not measured in immediate results, but in long-term, gentle ripples of understanding, trust, and connection. A narrow corridor brought them to a cluster of figures attempting a shared task. Hesitation, encouragement, and cooperation interwove like a delicate dance. Morty intervened only minimally, adjusting a platform slightly to allow safe passage while leaving the figures' initiative intact. They succeeded, and Morty felt a quiet satisfaction, the kind that comes from seeing the fruit of patience and subtle influence manifest naturally. He realized that the quietest actions often had the deepest impact, and that trust and care, once planted, could grow and flourish long after the moment of intervention. As the afternoon deepened, Morty paused at a balcony overlooking the glowing center of the park. He observed the intricate web of interactions, the hesitations softened into confidence, the encouragements blossoming into trust, the small interventions echoing across time. The park was no longer merely a miniature world. It had become a meditation on growth, connection, and the enduring effects of empathy and attentiveness. Morty felt a deep resonance within himself, a calm alignment with the lessons of the park and the rhythm of quiet heroism he had cultivated. Rick's voice came softly beside him, almost as if sharing a secret with both Morty and the park. Morty, today shows you the essence of what you've learned. Influence, empathy, presence, they echo. The ripples you create aren't always visible, but they shape everything around you. That's a quiet, enduring kind of heroism. Morty nodded, feeling the calm certainty of the lesson settle deep in his chest. He understood that the quiet acts of care and attentiveness he had cultivated over time were not just skills. They were ways of inhabiting the world, shaping it gently and leaving lasting traces of trust and connection. Evening arrived. Bathing the park in soft shadows, Morty felt a reflective fatigue tempered by profound contentment. He thought of the figures, the subtle interventions, and the delicate networks of connection that had unfolded over time. The lessons of patience, empathy, and quiet guidance had coalesced into a steady rhythm, a meditative pulse of understanding that extended beyond the miniature park and into life itself. Morty felt a quiet satisfaction, the soft warmth of knowing that small, thoughtful gestures could ripple through time and space in ways both profound and enduring. Returning to the warmth of the house, Morty settled by the window, snow drifting lazily outside. He reflected on the cumulative impact of subtle interventions, on the quiet heroism nurtured over days, and on the enduring power of patience, empathy, and presence. The park, Rick, and the lessons of connection and trust lingered in him, a soft affirmation that care, attentiveness, and quiet influence could leave lasting echoes far beyond the immediate moment. As night fully embraced the house, Morty allowed the reflections of the day to settle within him. The rhythm of subtle heroism, of empathetic presence and attentive influence pulsed gently in his chest. He exhaled slowly, feeling the calm satisfaction of understanding that quiet acts of care, applied with patience and attention, could ripple outward, shaping lives in ways both profound and lasting. Morty leaned back, ready to rest, carrying with him the gentle knowledge that the quiet heroism he had cultivated would continue to echo through the world.